Morning. Nice to see everyone. It's the first time I've spoken when there's so many people standing outside. It's incredible, isn't it? Morning to everybody sitting at the back over there as well. No pressure today then. Thanks, Bear. We've also got, I think we've got the youth in here somewhere as well, and Naomi's in here as well, so instant feedback at the end of this one. I've been given the topic of following on in the series that we've been having at the moment about the kind of I am statements that Jesus made. So my topic this morning is from John 15, where Jesus talks about being the true vine. So I'm going to read through the passage first, and then we'll dig into it a little bit. So it's John 15, starting at verse 1. This is Jesus speaking, I am the true vine. My Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I've spoken to you. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourself to be my disciples. It's a familiar passage, isn't it? It's one that I've heard lots and lots before. I've read lots and lots before. Heard people speaking on lots before. It's often a kind of phrase, a verse that's on pictures, and you see it on Facebook. I'm the vine, you're the branches. And I think sometimes familiarity, certainly for me, makes you kind of think you know it, and you gloss over it, and it's just the way it is, isn't it? Jesus is the vine, we are the branches. It's just what it is. And sometimes it's a bit more difficult to engage your brain and think about it, isn't it, when it's so familiar. I am the vine and you are the branches. Why does Jesus use that image of a vine? Now, I've often read that and thought, well, makes sense, doesn't it? Branches need to be attached to the vine. They can't grow, can't do anything unless they're attached to the stem. But why didn't Jesus talk about flowers? Why didn't he talk about trees? Why didn't he talk about any other plants? Because the same applies to all of those, doesn't it? Every plant needs to be connected to the rest of it in order to grow. Is there something in the vine itself? Is there something significant in that we're supposed to pick up? Or is it just as simple as what we see at face value, that we need to remain connected to Jesus in order to grow? Because that's how I've often seen it. Need to remain connected to Jesus in order to grow. Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? But whatever it is, there's something really important in this. At this point in his life, Jesus knew what was coming next. He knew that these were his final few days on earth in human form. And I guess we could all put ourselves perhaps in that position. We know we've just got a few days left. It's like when you go on holiday, isn't it, in a kind of shallow sense. You know you've only got a couple of days left and you want to do every single thing you possibly can do. In a much, much more profound sense, Jesus is knowing that he's only got a few more days left with his disciples. He wants every word to count, I think, and he wants to kind of get that message across. He knew he needed to get this message home. And he doesn't just say it as a throwaway comment, does he? It's not very often in the Bible that Jesus repeats himself over and over and over again. He says something, he's the master of kind of really pithy one-liners, isn't he? Jesus will say something that just kind of cuts right to the heart of what he wants to say and the people in front of him. But look at this passage. He doesn't just say, I'm the vine, you are the branches, you're going to get pruned and remain in me. Well, how many times does he say remain? About 7, 8 times? He kind of repeats it. I'm the vine, you're the branches. Remain in me, remain in me, remain. There's something really important here he wants to get across. He really, really wants them to take notice. It's a picture, isn't it? this picture of a vine. Jesus often speaks in pictures or in kind of allegories, sort of ways of describing concepts that are really a bit difficult for us mere mortals to understand. He kind of gives us a picture to kind of to anchor those on. And he often uses everyday objects, everyday things that people will be familiar with in order to try and get these complex things across. And I guess a vine would have been really common back then to the people he was speaking to. It was a society that was, vines were a kind of key way of life for a lot of people. Many people would have worked in or perhaps even owned a vineyard, maybe would have had a vine or two back at home, sort of surrounding their houses. Not only did they kind of produce fruit, but they were also quite good for shade. And vines were an important part of society and of life. And people listening would have been really familiar with kind of looking after vines. Vines are often used throughout the Bible as well, aren't they? So perhaps his listeners would have been familiar with the Torah, the first few books of the Bible, when the image of a vine is talked about a lot. Israel itself is often referred to as the vine. So it's a common concept. People would have been really familiar with vines in a way perhaps that we're not quite so familiar with these days. I mean, we know what vines are, but perhaps we're not kind of as sort of familiar with that. And do you know, I often wonder about it. Maybe it's just me and my weird mind. But I often wonder if Jesus was around today, would he have picked the same illustrations? Would he start talking about social media? Would he be using other things that we were familiar with? Would he be talking about cars? And if he was speaking to big crowds now, would he be talking about vines and vineyards? I don't know. It's an interesting one, isn't it? But I think, regardless, in order to really get under the skin of what he was trying to get across to his disciples, it's important for us just to spend a few minutes, if you'll indulge me, talking about viniculture. Like that, didn't you? Full disclosure, my knowledge about viniculture and vines comes almost entirely from my brother, who is a bit of a wine buff. Those who know, he lives in Italy, literally in amongst some of the most expensive vines in the world. And then I fact-checked some of his statements. It's always wise when it's your brother, isn't it? With some rather, how to put this politely, intense websites that are out there about wine and vines in the past week. So I've got some pictures. It's also just after holiday season, so I'm going to share some of my holiday snaps from you from previous years. So hopefully we'll get some pictures in a minute. Valdemar's looking at me panicked. I'm sorry, Valdemar. Hopefully they're there. Have we got some? Yeah, fab. Hopefully you can see that. This is a picture of a vineyard, and you can see all the kind of woody bits at the bottom and not a lot else. So, it turns out the most important bit of a vine is what they call the stalk, this kind of woody bit that kind of sits there. And the vine itself is kind of cut back every year to just this kind of lump and this woody bit. In general, the older this stalk, this woody bit is, the better the grapes and the better the wine that those grapes make. Takes 10 plus years for a vine to kind of build up to produce anything decent after it's been planted. And you get some vines that are kind of huge and woody and gnarled and have been there for kind of 40, 50 years or so. The interesting bit, though, really, is that every year, these vines get, you can't really see that, sorry, this is snow. Every year in winter, the person that looks after the vines, the vine keeper, the gardener, kind of cuts back every bit of the vine right back down to the stalk. So all the kind of branches are cut off every single year. And actually, even though the best grapes come from the most oldest stalk, they also come from the newest branches. So every year there's this new growth, and the grapes actually grow on this new growth that grows every year. Come back to that in a minute. Let's have the next one. But if you leave a vine without tending, this is what you get. It just kind of takes over. I say vines were useful for shade. They can grow kind of about 6 foot every couple of months, left untended, and they just kind of take over. Grapevines' natural tendency is to use all their energy in rapid growth. They produce loads of leaves and shoots, and they use hardly any energy at all into making fruit. So you get a wild or an untended grapevine, perhaps the vine tender has died and not passed on his vineyard, and you get something like this. Loads and loads of green leaves, woody growth, and hardly any grapes at all. Certainly they're just kind of little shriveled up seeds, really, not really much grapes. Next one. So each year, the vine tender cuts back the growth down to the stalk. In spring, there's all this kind of vigorous growth, and he picks 2 or 3 promising branches and kind of winds them around the support there, trains them to grow along these wires, and then once he's picked his 2 or 3 sprouts from each one of the stalks, he kind of trims back everything else. And the idea is to kind of keep this perfect balance between green growth, the leaves, and fruit growth. But that's only a proportion of what the vine tender needs to do. He spends weeks and weeks and weeks doing this, and then after that he needs to water them. One more slide, please. He needs to water them. He protects them from disease. He gives them just the right amount of shade, the right amount of sunshine. When there's frosts, he keeps them warm. They light little fires in amongst the vines, sometimes in order to kind of keep the frost off. A precise time of year, and everything is kind of controlled precisely. And obviously kind of the whole vineyard needs to be constantly weeded because all of that fertilizer and water makes weeds grow as well as the vines. Next one. Then you get lovely grapes like that. And then, next one, you get lovely bottles of wine like that. So a brief kind of foray into what it takes to look after a vineyard. So I think perhaps some of that helps us to understand what Jesus is talking to in the culture he's talking to at the time when he's talking about vineyards. So from that, what messages do you think he was trying to get across? There's probably loads, but I've picked on kind of 3 or 4 that I think are really, really important. I think the first part of picking a vine and talking about being the vine and the branches is to kind of really refer back to some of that Old Testament heritage. Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 21 talks about Israel being planted as a choice vine, a completely faithful seed. Israel is the vine that produces this amazing fruit. Psalm 80 talks about Israel being like a vine removed from Egypt. You transplanted a vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations. You planted it. You cleared the ground for it. It took root. It filled the land. There's this kind of concept of the nation of Israel, God's people, being a vine, a vigorous, beautiful vine. Hosea refers to Israel as a luxuriant vine, kind of a vine that's producing the most amazing fruit. And we often see the kind of fruit of the vine, wine and grapes, used as a symbol for righteousness throughout the Old Testament. And kind of even Jesus uses the wine and talks about his blood and righteousness. So I think the people he would have been speaking to, his disciples, would have been very familiar with this. They were coming out of a Jewish background. They would have understood all the kind of imagery around Israel being the luxuriant vine. And I think Jesus is kind of anchoring what he's saying in that our heritage, where we are today, comes out of that heritage of Jesus, of God's people, and Jesus coming out of God's people, coming out of Israel, in order for us to be a luxuriant vine, luxuriant and bountiful. We didn't just appear here by chance. We are part of that kind of rich heritage of God's people and being planted in the right place at the right time. So by saying that he's the vine, I think Jesus is anchoring himself in all that history, in God's plan for Israel, for his people. He's telling us that it's him who established God's people. It's him who sustains them. And the fruit that we grow is this kind of fruit of righteousness to be part of his people. So I think that's where the starting point. He's kind of anchoring himself in that kind of history. And then I think there's something really, really interesting, and the reason why I went on that slight detour with all my holiday pictures is about the fruit. Some of the most expensive wines, some of the best grapes in the world come from some of the oldest vines. And yet, as we've seen, it isn't the branches that are old. The branches grow every year, and they're cut right back at the end of every year. So logically, how can someone taste the difference between grapes or wine that comes from an old vine and that comes from a kind of weedy new one, if it's all coming from new growth and new branches every year? And I think that's because the fruit doesn't come from the new branches, does it? The fruit comes from that old woody stock. It's that woody stock, that vine, that produces the fruit through the branches. I'll say that again. It's the vine that produces the fruit, not the branches. The branches bear the fruit, but they don't make it. They don't produce it. So if we remain connected to the vine, then it's Jesus' fruit that's produced through us, grows on us, but isn't made by us. It's not our fruit. Now, I don't think I got that until this week. And this is one of those bits that I mean when you kind of read it and you gloss over it. But unless you start to kind of dig into it and try and understand the kind of imagery that Jesus is referring to, that you miss something sometimes. You might already be there. I'm talking for me. But I hadn't really got that. There's quite a profound difference, isn't there? We don't produce fruit. Jesus produces the fruit in us. We're just the ones that show it off to the world. We talk about fruits of the Spirit, don't we? The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And that's exactly what they are. But they're the fruits of the Spirit, produced through me, not me producing the fruit of the Spirit. Jesus' fruit in us isn't anything we've done. And I think what he's saying is all we need to do is to remain in him. If we just do that one simple thing, then he's the one that produces this most amazing, luscious, juicy, valuable, great-tasting fruit through us. We're not told to work hard at producing fruit, are we? We're not told to. Jesus doesn't say, I'm the vine, you are the branches, so go and work hard and produce the most amazing fruit you can. He says, remain in me, and you will bear fruit through me. It's not us working, striving, trying, working hard. The greater we are at something, the more we try at something. No, we just remain, and the fruit comes. So that's 2. Number 3. This is the bit that is more difficult, perhaps, is pruning. And I think we get that, don't we? And we get this analogy of pruning, that kind of God is the gardener and he cuts stuff back. But the more you begin to understand vines, the more you understand that pruning isn't an optional or occasional thing. It's a constant, every single day, absolutely essential thing. We saw that picture of the kind of untended vine, didn't we? Leggy, green, uncontrolled growth, tiny little fruit. Do we want to be like that? Sure, we're growing. We're even producing a little bit of fruit. And you could certainly say, wow, that's a great big vine. But is it producing the right sort of fruit? Is it producing the most amazing, valuable, luscious fruit? Is it the best fruit that vine could ever produce if it were to be pruned? Each season, the vine tender, the gardener, kind of cuts back it selects the most strongest and the most promising parts of the new growth and prunes back the rest, and constantly does that throughout the whole season. He's constantly got his tiny little clippers and he's clipping bits away. It's an absolute art. These vine tenders are, most of them are kind of, I guess they're outside in the sun all day long, but they look about 150. But they probably are close to it. They may be in their 20s, just lots of sun damage, I don't know. But this is a real art. It's passed down from father to son to daughter. It's a real kind of art. He prunes and trains the vines to grow in the very, very best way. There was a study which I found on one of these intense websites, which looked at the most efficient way of growing grapes done in California. It won't surprise you to realize that. And it turns out that the most efficient ratio of leaves to fruit for this particular type of grape, and it's different for every type of grape, is somewhere between 1 to 1.2 meters squared of leaf per kilogram of fruit. The really interesting thing is when they looked at, so they were able to do this kind of scientifically in California, and they can get an AI that picks up the leaves and tells them which ones to cut. But actually you compare that with the people who do it by art back in kind of Italy and France and other stuff, and they're almost precisely there. And they've learned this over generation and generation. They just kind of look at it and go. Jenny and Tony are probably experts at pruning things back. My pruning in the garden, as Jacob knows very well, is just to take a big thing and just chop everything back. Yeah. Jacob tells me off every year for killing the garden, but it grows back. It's lovely. But that's not the kind of pruning that Jesus is talking about here. It's that precise kind of, these tiny little clippers that they use. These clippers are kind of passed down from generation to generation. Pruning makes the fruit grow bigger, it makes it go stronger, it's more plentiful, it's much sweeter. The grapes that we saw in those pictures back there would only grow on a vine that is kind of pruned and has got this precise ratio of green leaf to fruit. Without pruning, the branches would go rogue. They'd start heading off in loads of different directions all at once, growing, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and growing, doing and getting more and more and more, and not producing much in the way of fruit. I don't know about you, but that's a bit close to home sometimes. Actually, what Jesus is saying is, don't just go and do things. Yes, sure, you'll grow, but I want you to produce my fruit. Don't just do, don't just grow, don't just kind of go off in hundreds of different directions. Allowing our lives to be pruned, not wild, untamed, constant doing, constant busyness, but actually just remaining in Jesus, remaining in him, and allowing the Father to do that pruning, to train us to grow in the way he wants us to grow. Encourage that perfect ratio of growth to fruit. I want the perfect amount of green growth and the perfect amount of fruit. I don't just want to be going off in loads of different directions. That's the third thing. So number 4, the best fruit comes from this kind of perfect relationship between the vine, this kind of woody stock, the branches which are growing, and the gardener. We saw earlier that the gardener's job isn't just pruning, although it's a big part of it. It's feeding, it's watering, it's protecting, it's keeping warm, it's weeding. It's kind of a year-round job. This is probably why they all look 150. In the best vineyards, the vine tender protects the vine from diseases and pests, adds exactly the right amount of minerals and fertilizers to the soil, keeps those early spring frosts and autumn frosts around. They light fires at the end of these kind of rows of vines, and then pick up the hot coals and move the hot coals along just to kind of raise the temperature just by 0.5 degree, 1 degree, just enough to keep the frost off this low-hanging fruit in the kind of early spring when the grapes are just growing. They protect the vines from particularly sunny days. They will often kind of put kind of canopies along one side just to give just the right amount of sunshade to the growing fruit, and then take it away later in the year when the sun perhaps they're more able to deal with it. Just the right amount of water, not too little, not too much, a little bit here, a little bit there. It's only when those conditions are absolutely perfect and that kind of the synergy between the branches growing as they're supposed to grow, bearing the fruit they're supposed to bear, the vine doing its job, the gardener and the vine tender doing his job, that's when you get the most amazing fruit. If one of those 3 is out of sync, then the fruit suffers. If the branches aren't connected properly to the vine, you don't get great fruit. If the branches are going off in hundreds of different directions and they're not being pruned properly, you don't get great fruit. If there's not the kind of right synergy between the gardener and all of those acts that need to happen every day, you don't get great vineyard, great fruit. So that's, I think, what Jesus is saying as well, that we need to kind of live our lives in synergy with the Father and the Son, working in tandem. Tandem is 2, whatever 3 is. Allowing ourselves to be pruned, but also allowing ourselves to be protected, to be fed, to be watered, to remain connected to the Son, to be fed, to be sheltered by the Father. Interesting aside, just for a moment. it's also really interesting in those pictures how you never really get one vine by itself, do you? The vine by itself was the one that was growing up the telegraph pole and just kind of sprouting off in loads of different directions. They're nearly always in vineyards. They're surrounded by other vines. They're in big kind of long rows. I don't think that's a coincidence. Vines aren't growing them together gives them that protection from the elements. They're able to kind of protect each other. They have their own little microclimate. They're able to produce the right amount of kind of oxygen and carbon dioxide and transpiration, whatever it is. A long while ago I did biology. Growing them protects them from the elements. It allows that fertilizer and that watering to kind of be spread more efficiently. If the vine tender had to kind of go around massive fields kind of fertilizing and watering this one and then running over there fertilizing and watering that one, it would take a lot longer. But actually kind of being able to spread the fertilizer and the water around to just this kind of concentrated vineyard makes the job much easier and much more successful. So I think we not only need to remain connected to the vine and submit to the care of the vine tender, the gardener, we also need to be part of a vineyard and part of a kind of vineyard together to allow the fertilizer and the water and the care to be kind of spread amongst all of us. The gardener's job, of course, is to look after the entire vineyard. He doesn't just look after one vine. He takes the big picture view. Oftentimes you'll get, in one of those pictures we saw just then, there is a kind of massive great vineyard that kind of spreads the whole over the hill. But they produce different bottles of wine from different bits of the vineyard. Some fruit is a bit sweeter, some is a bit more rich in other bits and pieces that they need in wine, tannins and other stuff. Depending on the soil makeup, the external conditions, there's a slightly more rounded flavor. Some vineyards will kind of blend it all together. Others will take just a bit from this one, just a bit from that one. And I think that's the same in our vineyard, in our church, isn't it? And in the wider church, we're not all exactly the same. Different bits of the vineyard are producing slightly different fruit, but they're all producing the best possible fruit they can. And it's only when you blend all of that together you get the most amazing bottles of wine. But the better the gardener, the better the vines, of course, the better the fruit and the better the end result. So that's the imagery. I think that's all well and good. We've got this rich Old Testament heritage that Jesus is referring to. We know that it's the vine that's producing the fruit. It's not us that's going around kind of trying very hard to produce fruit. We're good at trying, aren't we? Pruning's essential. It's not optional. It's kind of constant. And that the best fruit comes from that complete synergy between the vines, the gardener and the branches. But then there's this kind of concept of remain. Remain in me. He says it like 7 times or something I was counting. There's something really important in it. What does he mean to remain in him? And I guess it's something that we gloss over. I gloss over it a bit as well. Remain in me. Okay, well that means kind of staying a Christian, continuing to believe and going to church, doesn't it? Remain. But I think there's so much more to it than that. Remain, I guess, means kind of, if you take it down to its base level, it means to stay, doesn't it? To stay, to remain. We kind of remain somewhere, it means we stay somewhere. And I think that's true. It's a big part of what Jesus is saying here, particularly when you think about that kind of uncontrolled growth. He's talking about remaining and staying and resting. Rob was talking about it last week, wasn't he? Not constantly doing and constantly trying to grow and kind of trying to do things in our own strength, but actually just taking time to be with Jesus, to remain in him and to rest. But I think there's something in this remain about a deliberate choice. Sometimes when you say remain in me, it's a kind of passive thing. I'm going to remain in bed this morning because I can't be bothered to get up. I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about remain in me because you can't be bothered to do anything else. He's talking about make this deliberate decision to remain in me. It's not a passive thing, not just staying there by default because it's easier to stay than make a decision to do something else. Not staying or remaining just because we haven't got the energy to do anything else. Not just staying, but choosing deliberately to remain, actively taking that decision. Why do I feel really strongly about that? Well, I think Jesus feels really strongly about that in the way he describes it. He says, remain in me and I will remain in you. We do the remaining and he does the remaining. I've never met the side of Jesus that is passive, sitting there because he can't be bothered to do anything else, that just kind of says, I'll stay here then. That's not the Jesus I know. That's not the Jesus that's in the Bible, is it? It's not the Jesus we experience. Jesus is actively doing, and he's remaining by actively doing, so we need to remain by actively doing. Everything Jesus does is new every morning. It's deliberate. It's a choice. And so should our remaining be, new every morning, deliberate, a choice. If he makes a deliberate choice every day to remain in us, we have to make a deliberate choice every day to remain in him, to rest in him. So I think it's about resting. I've got some R's, got 4 of them. I think it's also about removing, just as the gardener does and removes all those weeds and removes all the things that kind of get in the way. We have to do the same. We all have them. Stuff, busyness, life, patterns of thought, whatever it might be. We've all got things that take away our attention from Jesus. Most of them aren't bad things in themselves, are they? Going to work, earning money, doing good things, seeing friends. All good things. There's nothing wrong with them. But when they start to take our focus away from remaining, then I think we need to pull back a little bit and remain. The world's full of distractions, more and more and more, isn't it? As time goes on, we have these devices that are constantly and deliberately engineered to distract us. That's not a coincidence, is it? Distraction has to be one of the key weapons that the enemy has in our age, just distracting us away from that focus and that remain in Jesus. If we can be convinced to spend our time on other things, we don't have time to rest and remain in Jesus, do we? The world sometimes sees kind of rest and stopping as a bad thing. We should be on the go the whole time. But actually Jesus says, remain in me, rest in me, remove some of those things. Thirdly, I think it's about recharging. The branches that we talked about, the branches of the vine, get all of their energy and all their nutrients from the vine. They don't have roots of their own. They do it through the vine. They get all of their energy through the roots and through the vine. But they need to be connected to the vine in order to live. And I think that's the same with us. One of my thought games I play is, what would Jesus have talked about in these kind of days and ages? Would he have used those different analogies I said earlier? Would he have talked about remaining plugged in? I don't know. That's how I kind of think of this one, kind of drawing our power and our strength, not from ourselves, our work, our family, what we kind of perceive ourselves to be, but actually from Jesus. Come all you who are weak and I will give you rest. Come everyone who's low in power, plug yourself into me, I'll recharge you. Those who drink of this water will never be thirsty again. Those who charge their batteries in me will never run out. It's a good thought game to play. I'm not kind of saying that that's how Jesus would have said, but actually we need to try and anchor some of the things he was saying in our own life and our own experience. We need to be recharged. We need to be refilled. We need to draw our energy from Jesus. And then lastly, I think it's about remembering. The other bit that Jesus says, when he says, remain in me and I will remain in you, he also talks about his words remaining in us. And I think there's something here about head knowledge and heart knowledge. We talk about that a lot, don't we? That actually it's really important, not just to know Jesus with our head, but it's also important to know Jesus and have a relationship with him. But we need to be careful about that kind of baby in the bathwater, don't we? It's not just about heart knowledge. It's not just about having a relationship with him. It's also about knowing his words remaining in us. Because that head knowledge, as important as heart knowledge is, head knowledge is important as well. The word is important. Spending time, committing it to memory, meditating on it. Rob was talking again last week. Part of remaining in Jesus is to know what his teachings are, to know what he said, to know what his word says. And then we'll know the true vine and the gardener. So as I wrap up, I think it's really important that we remember our heritage, remember where we come from, remember who we're created to be, this fruitful, bountiful vine that comes out of everything that God had planned for this world. It's the vine, the root, Jesus, that produces fruit. It isn't us. It's not our job. Our job is just to remain connected. His job is to produce the fruit through us. Pruning isn't optional or even occasional. It's totally necessary and absolutely essential every single day. And that best fruit comes from that synergy between the vines, between Jesus, the branches, us, and the gardener, God. We need to be in a vineyard, not just on our own as a kind of leggy, uncontrolled vine. Remain in me, and I will remain in you, and you will bear much fruit. We remain by resting. We remain by removing those distractions. We remain by recharging, and we remain by remembering. Thank you for your indulgence.